Welcome and ting and ting and ting. Back with another one for you and ting. And we're going back to Ireland, you all. You know, the point of this video is to show people the history of people, the culture of people who have been marginalized to a certain degree all over the world, be it Africa, South America, wherever you are. I'm going to react to your history, you know what I mean? Let the world know what the vibe is and why people think the way they think and stuff, especially if you look at it from a historical perspective. All right? This one is called Ireland's Workhouses. Let's go ahead and YouTube and simmer and see what this Workhouses is all about.
The workhouse has been described as the most feared and hated institution ever established in Ireland. It was an organization which operated in Ireland for a period of some 80 years, from the early 1840s to the early 1920s. There were 163 workhouses in total, dotted around the country. If people could not support themselves, they could come into the workhouse. Here they would work in return for food. People had to stay and live in the workhouse, and so the system was known as indoor relief. The whole family had to enter together. This was a way for the landlords to clear the land of tenants who could not pay rent. Life in the workhouse was meant to be harsh so as not to encourage people to stay. One of the cruelest aspects of the workhouse was that family members were split up into separate quarters.
You know, but they're talking about the workhouses, the people who couldn't feed themselves and had no place to stay. And I look around here and there's just so much homeless. And it's a matter of time before they start having workhouses. It is a matter of time before they start having workhouses where they tell you come for the job and you can stay here and work and just give them food. Very little, absolutely non-nutritious. So basically, they just work. The things we do to each other, isn't it crazy, y'all? Let's keep going here.
Children aged 2 or less could stay with their mothers. Sometimes, family members never saw each other again.
Wow.
The workhouse was not a prison. People could leave if they liked. The high walls surrounding the workhouses were for keeping people out, not for keeping people in. In Ireland, under Brehon law, native laws dating back to Celtic times, rulers had to take care of the sick and the poor. In the 5th century, Christianity came to Ireland and with it, monasteries began to develop. Over time, these monasteries took on the role of caring for the less fortunate. From the mid-1500s, Ireland was invaded by Protestant English settlers. The land was taken from the Irish, the religious were prosecuted, and the whole care system broke down. The situation was so bad that by the beginning of the 1800s, it is estimated that some 2.3 million people were at near starvation level. At the time Ireland's population was nearing 8 million. By this time most of Ireland's small farmers and landless labourers were dependent on the potato as their main food. In England, Scotland and Wales there was poverty too. The workhouse was an English system. The first workhouses...
See, this is what I'm talking about, okay? You're talking about the workhouses here. And I always ask, what about the poor people who live under the colonizers? And anybody could be a colonizer. I'm not picking on the British. I'm not picking on anybody in particular. Just colonizers in general, because a tribe could colonize another tribe in Africa, South America, Native Americans, wherever. The question is, are they taking care of their own people? Or are the own people just an instrument for them to use also to take care of their own wealth and their own well-being? Because in every society, the poor people is looked down on. It's like here where, some people think they have privileges and stuff like that, but then I go to work with them and they're in the same boat, paycheck to paycheck, just like everybody else. But then they tell them, hey, that person is the problem. Immigrants is the problem. Black people are the problem. Gay people are the problem. This is the problem. So then they're thinking that the reason why they're in the position they're in is those people, when in actuality, it's not those people that's are in the problem. Those aren't the people that's the problem. The problem is those who are hoarding the wealth and using the people, poor people, as instruments to further their wealth and further their legacies and stuff like that. And it's hard that some people argue and say, oh, you keep complaining about the poor people, but it's a reality. You just look around and you see it. I mean, we don't have a system of kings and where people are taking care of their family and the next family member is going to be the king or the queen, or a family member is going to take over the rule or anything like that. But it's still there, because if you look at politics, you have the father is a politician, then you have a brother that's a politician, an uncle or whatever you want to call him, and then their children is in politics. And look at the Kennedys, man. They've been in politics for decades. And you could just go on to here and see how many siblings are in Congress or in the government in general, because it could be federal or local, or how many sons and daughters are into politics. Or even if they don't go into politics, they would get the better job still outside of politics, because, George Bush's daughter was a talk show host for a while. Making the big bucks. They're getting taken care of, period. And quite frankly, a lot of the times it doesn't matter the color, the ethnicity, or nothing like that. It's the status, the money. You understand what I'm saying? And that's what people fail to realize. Or they realize it. However, to cope with it, they blame somebody else for it. Or they let themselves believe that somebody else is to be blamed for it, because then they have in their mind some kind of superiority over somebody else. And it's kind of sad how people are being manipulated, and it happens all over the world, not just here, all over the world.
In England opened in 1836. Almost 700 workhouses were built in England and Wales. The main concern of the Poor Law Commissioners in England was to ensure that the system was not abused by lazy people. Scotland, by contrast, had a more humane system based on outdoor relief. One of the key differences between England and Ireland at the time was that work was available in England, whereas in Ireland, whilst people were willing to work, there was no employment. In 1800, under the Act of Union, Ireland became part.
And we're seeing that right now. You say, oh, these people are lazy, they don't want to work, and it's just underprivileged people in general. They don't want to work, they're lazy. And you hear politicians say that all the time here. People are lazy, they don't want to work, they just want to give people, they just want to get stuff for free. But a lot of people want to work. There's just not enough to go around. So then they blame those people that don't work for not working, because there's work, you could work. And then when you do find the work, it's not enough to pay the bills. You're still struggling. You still need aid from the government. It's like you're under control. You know what I'm saying?
Part of Britain. Numerous committees were set up to investigate the extreme poverty in Ireland, but nothing was done. However, as more and more Irish people flocked to Britain in search of employment, the British government acted and sent over one of the English Poor Law Commissioners, George Nichols, to find a solution. This was his first time in Ireland. He did a quick tour and reported back that Ireland needed a workhouse system similar to the English one. The Irish Poor Law Act became law in 1838.
So they were doing it to their own people already. They just decided to implement it elsewhere. They were doing it to their own poor. That's crazy. From what I'm gathering here, you have to institute that in Ireland now, just like we instituted it over there. Can't blame the British people in general for stuff, you know what I mean? You got to blame the people who are instituting these things. You understand what I'm saying? But you also have to blame poor people to a certain degree for letting themselves be manipulated into thinking, or certain poor people for letting themselves be manipulated into thinking that they have the upper hand, and then those other poor people are the problem. Like we have a what you call an EBT card here. They call it used to be called food stamps. And the people that are some people that I work with who are paycheck to paycheck, they complain about the other people getting help. Why are you complaining? They're struggling, you're struggling. Maybe we should find out why we're struggling like this. And it's not laziness. I highly, you know what I mean? People, it's really frustrating, actually.
The Poor Law Act divided the country into 130 unions. A further 33 were added after the famine years. Each union was to have a workhouse, and the workhouses were to be financed by a tax on land. George Wilkinson was appointed as architect to the Irish Poor Law Commissioners to design and supervise the building of the workhouses. The first workhouses opened in 1841. Before the famine years, the number of people entering the workhouses was low. People were slow to leave their holdings. However, by the autumn of 1846, it became clear just how bad the situation was. The potato crop was diseased and inedible. It was emigration, starvation, or the workhouse. People began to flood in. The system, based as it was on indoor relief, could not cope with the overcrowding, the disease and the deaths. Corpses, without coffins, were carried on carts day after day to be thrown into mass burial pits in the grounds of the workhouse. The years from 1846 to 1851 are known as the famine years. It should be noted, however, that while the potato crop was largely wiped out through disease, there were plenty of other foodstuffs such as grain and livestock being exported to England. After the famine years, the numbers of people entering the workhouse decreased, and over time it became a place for people that society did not want. Unmarried mothers, children born outside of marriage, orphaned and abandoned children, lunatics and idiots, old and infirm people, tramps who traveled the roads.
People that they deem indesirable are the ones that ends up there. People that don't have the capacity to take care of themselves, especially like single moms back then, they're probably going to be looked down on because of probably religious belief or some kind of a moral code, you know, oh, look at them, you know, they look down on them. And it's not as overt in today's society because there's a lot of single moms out there. However, to a certain degree, they still get looked down on.
Between 1838 and 1921, the principal features of the poor law and the workhouse system remained largely unchanged. The system was abolished in the early 1920s, when Ireland gained independence from Britain. Life in the workhouse was harsh and, frequently, it was cruel. There were many rules. The food was poor. There was little to do. People were separated from their families, hungry, frustrated, badly treated, bored and mostly without hope. Often the inmates reacted against this by breaking the rules and by fighting amongst themselves. Some preferred prison to the workhouse as the food was better and the regime not as strict. Staff were often ex-policemen or army. There was a very high dismissal rate, with many of staff being cruel, incompetent and dishonest. The diet varied somewhat from workhouse to workhouse. Generally, it consisted of stirabout, which is like porridge, milk and potatoes. Children got bread. Adults received 2 meals a day and children 3. Reports of the time show that the food was often of very poor quality. The workhouse diet remained very basic, and it was not until the end of the 1800s that tea, bread for adults and a meat soup dinner were introduced. Very little productive work was carried out. One of the rules was that the workhouse should not enter into competition with outside businesses. When numbers in the workhouse were large, it was difficult to find work for everyone. In the earlier years, the capstan wheel was in operation in some workhouses. Women and children, maybe up to several hundred, went around in circles pushing a big wheel for grinding corn. Breaking stones for building roads was a common occupation for the men. The women did domestic jobs such as cleaning or helping in the kitchen or laundry and looking after the sick. Older inmates were put to work mending clothes and spinning wool.
Everybody
Girls were
worked.
meant to be trained for domestic service. Oakum picking was carried out in many workhouses.
You know, that kind of mirror how the school system is anymore. You know, if you keep them at a certain level of education, they can't really get ahead. Because as much as people would think here that education don't really mean anything, you could just get a job with it. And I hear that so many more, but you're not going to elevate. Or it's going to be harder to elevate if you don't have the necessary education to elevate. You know what I mean? Because even though you might have obstacles in your way, if you have the necessary education to understand the system of which you live under, you could still probably find loopholes and ways to get ahead. Of course, in the case of severe prejudice, it's near impossible. You understand?
This involved separating out the strands of old ship rope so that it could be reused. There were large numbers of children in the workhouse. In 1850, there were up to 120,000 children. Conditions were terrible for them. An English clergyman who was in Ireland at the time expressed his shock at the total failure to provide for these children. He described the children in Limerick workhouse as skeletons covered in sores and dressed in rags. Many of the children who survived the famine years grew up in the workhouse. They have been described as having the same guttural voice, a blank expression, and of having a strange similarity. These children only knew the workhouse existence. Children were supposed to go to school in the workhouse where they were meant to learn reading, writing, arithmetic and the principles of the Christian religion. The reality was quite different. School teachers were often incompetent and cruel, incapable of teaching enormous classes of hungry and dirty children. From the 1860s onwards, social reformers pressed for the boarding out of children to foster.
See, my mom had a couple of sayings, a couple of things she used to say. A hungry man is an angry man. Of course, there's going to be a dissension in the place. They're going to fight against each other. It's human nature. They want to survive. Also, you can't learn on a hungry belly. She always made sure we eat something and have something to eat before we go to work, to school, I mean. So that's where all of that, those thoughts came from, or the ideas, or those statements. Wow. Crazy, huh?
Families. But this was slow to happen, probably because the workhouse would have had to pay the foster families. From about the 1870s onwards, the religious orders began to get involved and started setting up industrial schools, where children were meant to receive training. By the early 1900s, the days of children in the workhouse were beginning to draw to a close. Yet, in many respects, and as we have become to realize, the taking over of the care of children by the religious orders in Ireland was a much worse fate than any within the walls of the workhouse. One of the ways that workhouse numbers decreased was through emigration. The cost of emigration to landlords was less than that of keeping paupers in the workhouse. An emigration commission was set up. Its representatives visited every workhouse in Ireland. Those who wanted to emigrate were offered free passage, clothing, and a little money. Between the years 1848 to 1850, 4,175 orphan girls aged 14 to 18 left Irish workhouses for Australia under a scheme supported by the Australian government. In the 1850s, the Poor Law started to assist young female paupers to Canada, where there was demand for domestic servants. Over 15,000 girls were sent there alone. Though separate, the workhouse was also paradoxically a part of the locality in which it was situated. It provided business to local suppliers, some employment, and medical care to the general population. Originally, the workhouse infirmary or hospital was just for the sick inmates. No qualifications were required for nurses and the level of care was very poor. From the 1860s, qualified nursing sisters began to make their way into the workhouses. Care of the sick improved greatly and the workhouse hospital was opened to non-inmates. These local hospitals were missed by many when the system was abolished in the early 1920s. Some of the workhouses became county hospitals or homes. However, for generations that followed, people had no full fear of spending their final years in the county home, being as it was part of the workhouse system.
Wow. I fear we heading in that direction again. History is going to repeat itself, unfortunately. It's crazy. I hope you guys learned something from this year, you know what I mean? And you could compare that. I watched a video about Romania, but it was about kids, and it was a British guy who went to Romania to work in these orphanages and stuff, and how the children were treated there. And this was later on in the years, you know what I mean? So we keep doing that to each other, and every country has got that issue. Every country has had that issue at some point in its history. I could say we have to do better, but that's becoming kind of cliche to say. We all know that. We all know we have to do better. And there's a thought that I've had in my head for a long time. People say I think simplistically, but if it's such a simplistic way of thinking, that should entail that it's simple to do. Then why can't we do it? We make it so complex because some people don't want to lose their money to help others. And that's just the fact right there. They just want to hold all the money. Man, I hope you guys are having a good weekend. I'm recording this on Sunday, so that's why I'm saying weekend. You all take care of each other, all right? Cool runnings.